Welcome to Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Let me start that over. Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast. We have a special episode for you today. We're going to cover our favorites and discuss the project so far. The initial project was to read 52 books in 2017, and we have made it through 52 podcast episodes. So we've covered 52 books, and just want to kind of take a step back, talk about our favorites, some takeaways, some key lessons that we saw across a lot of those books, what we're doing moving on, what the podcast
Forward,
will look
not
like
on.
going forward.
We're not quitting. We're not quitting. We're not moving on. We're moving forward.
We're going places.
Ever forward.
And then if we have some time left, we'll hit some other takeaways, maybe more on a personal front of things we've taken away from this project so far. So let's go ahead and get started then. Jason, you want to start off your 5, going from number 5 to number 1, and we can just switch off back and forth.
Yeah, and just to make this clear for everybody who's listening, we're actually working from 2 different lists here because Eric decided to do this episode based on the 2017 list. That's a little ways ago in terms of when he actually finished all those books, but from his 2017 list. And I'm doing it based on the first 52 episodes of the podcast itself. So I'm not including anything that we haven't podcasted on. And I'm including some of the 2018 books in my list. So we're going to have a slightly different list that we're working from here. In any case, I'm also going to cheat, as is my way, and put a 6th book on there because I couldn't make a decision on number 5. So there's a tie for 5. I'll go ahead and start with 5A, I guess, or 5B, whichever you prefer, with Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. This was definitely one of my favorite reads so far. Definitely a challenging book, a book that is going to force the reader to think a lot about it. I also think it's one of our better episodes, though maybe a little over length. But there was so much to talk about in that book, and there were so many things of real interest in that book that I've found it valuable to continue to think about since reading it. It's one of the books that I've gone back to. I've revisited the most since reading it. And it's not because I agree with everything in the book, but because it forces you to think through some things. So really, really enjoyed that book quite a bit. In terms of perhaps the main lesson from that book, it has to do with considering the cost of our hidden philosophical commitments that we may not even think we have culturally and otherwise, and considering what may be coming down the pike in terms of technology and otherwise, and how that may change our societies in ways that we may or may not like, but we need to really consider it.
Yeah, that was a really good one. My number 5 book is Start With Why by Simon Sinek. And the reason this one was so high up for me is it helped me reshape my thinking of my own work and my own business and what I pursue, but then it also really helped me in my meetings with clients. I use this book all the time when I meet with my clients. And the basic premise is, instead of starting with what you do when you talk to people, start with why you do it. And then he gives a lot of examples of the companies that do that and how that makes them successful. And then you, as a consumer of that product or service, you're going to identify with a company based on their why and not necessarily their what. So I think just huge ramifications for the ways companies do business, how they think about what they do, and how they talk about what they do. And then for me as a website developer, I've walked a lot of my clients through, okay, this is the content that we want to have on this page because this is the why, this is your why, and this is what we should put on the about page, and just kind of rethinking my whole way of putting together websites from that one book.
Yeah, yeah, and that one actually was one that that would have been probably in my somewhere between 7 and 10 area. I also really like that book quite a bit. All right, so I guess it's my turn for number 5A or B, whichever one you prefer that one be, and that is The Effective Executive.
Oh yeah.
So really, really got a lot out of Peter Drucker's book, a book that that really emphasizes the practices that you have to put in play in order to be not just efficient but effective. A lot of times we focus on efficiencies and trying to do the things that we're doing with minimum effort, maximum result, or maximum results per effort, and all of that. But the thing that Drucker really forces you to do in this book is to rethink not just how you're doing things in terms of the efficiency level, but what you're doing. And this is really related actually to the Start With Why book in that regard, in that Drucker forces you to he wants you to reconsider, like, if you're trying to get to this point, why are you doing all these things instead of these things? Reevaluate where your priorities are in order to get the best results that you're wanting to be effective in getting to the purpose that you've outlined. So, those books actually pair really well together.
Yeah. Yeah. My number 4, and I've already forgotten the pronunciation, but is it Heraclitean fire?
Heraclitean fire.
Is that right?
Yep, Heraclitean fire, or you can go Heraclitean fire if you really want to go closer to the Greek, but Heraclitean is almost certainly how he's envisioning you pronounce that in English.
And this one was by Erwin Chargaff, and it was suggested by Eric Weinstein. It was one of the least known books in terms of looking at Goodreads or Amazon. I mean, just very few people have given it a review. So it seems like Eric Weinstein saw this and loved it and suggested it, and we picked it up for our list. And I loved it, and I wasn't expecting it to be in my top 5, but it was just a pleasurable book to read. He was from Austria, and so he had a lot but he taught in the States, and so he just had a lot of unique, insightful things to say about the States, and then especially insightful things to say about the academy and the sciences and the way things were going with the sciences. And I just found it to be a delightful book and one that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and actually another one that was very similar to that one is, of course, one that's better known. That surely you must be joking, Mr. Feynman, but I agree. I think Heraclitean Fire is an excellent book and worth the read, and should be more widely read than it often is.
Well, and just for anyone who does want to read it, the hardback can get a little pricey, but I did find a website, and it's a university website that offers the ebook version for free. So you just do a search for that, and
or just
I think
check
we have
the
it in our show notes.
Yeah, it's in the show notes.
Yep.
Yeah, and it'll be in the show notes of this episode now.
Yeah.
So yeah, my number 4 is The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. I thought that was a very valuable book. As a creative, as someone who does a lot of writing, and in addition to podcasting, I'm also working on finishing a couple book projects, and I've done my share of articles and such. I have a lot of creative projects. This is a book that I need to revisit, and it's probably worth me taking a look at this book once every couple of years or so, because it really talks about the kind of things the kind of practices. Again, the effective executive is about learning to filter out the non-essentials in order to get to the things that you want, that you actually value to be effective. Well, this is that for creatives. It's how to do that, and it's thoughts on that. in thinking about how to, unblock yourself in terms of the creative process, and how to put yourself in the best possible position to have the kind of creative flow that you want as a producer of creative content. And to me, it's a really worthwhile book. It's something that I'll revisit probably in 2019, and remind myself of many of these ideas, because and also there's kind of a quasi spiritual component of it that really resonated with me in a number of ways as a creator, because again, there's this notion of letting creativity flow through you rather than trying to generate it, but putting yourself in positions to actually receive that kind of flow. And that really resonated with me. And I found this to be a very valuable book.
I like how you connected it to the effective executive too. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's also connected to a book that I'm putting on my 2019 list, which is actually Essentialism.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Anyway.
All right. Well, this is the only book of my top 5 here that we haven't podcasted on yet. So just one that you won't find an episode for. And this was The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. This was about the early astronauts. So this was a nonfiction book about the early astronauts, and not the ones that went to the moon, but the ones that kind of paved the way for everyone going afterward. And the right stuff, like these guys had to have the right stuff to get to that point. They were airline pilots, and then they just had to go through all these strenuous tests to get to the point where they would have the right stuff to go up into space. And just some amazing stories. The book ends with just unbelievably crazy story about Chuck Yeager. I can still visualize that in my head, and just astounding. I love Tom Wolfe. I've read some of his other books, and this one was amazing. And to think, I mean, I wasn't alive then, but my dad was. I bought this book for my dad. Just to think that this was a generation ago when this stuff was going on is really amazing. And if you decide to read this, you may splurge on the money that you saved by not buying Heraclian Fire, and splurge on they have a full picture version of The Right Stuff with actual footage of these guys as they're being written about. So you may consider purchasing that book. I got that. I read the smaller version of the book, but then bought the picture one too to look through that, because I just love the book so much. And that one was suggested by Cal Fussman, who is someone I've grown to really enjoy these last few years as well.
Yeah, and we will be podcasting actually on that book here within the next 2 or 3 episodes to actually get that one out. So if you are interested in hearing more about that, we'll be actually adding that to the podcast before too long. So my number 3 is Dune. I really liked Dune. I know, Eric, that was not one of your favorites. This is one of the books on which we were most divided. Frank Herbert's classic here, recommended by Kelly Starrett. I'm a sucker for space and time travel. I'm a sucker for high fantasy and so on. And so this kind of hit me in the sweet spot, and there's all sorts of really interesting sociological aspects to the narrative that Herbert puts together, and all sorts of interesting things to kind of get your mind working in all sorts of different ways as you're playing through this alternate universe. And I found it really stimulating and really enjoyable, and recommend it for anybody who likes that kind of literature, that kind of genre, which, Eric, you are not one of those people. So no. You didn't love this one, but I really did. I enjoyed it a lot, and have this one very high on my list still.
Nice. My number 2 is Once an Eagle by Anton Meyer. It was suggested by General Stanley McChrystal. and this one was a 1,300 plus page epic.
It's really
Of
3 books in one, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's 3 books in one volume. It's yeah. This, by the way, is my number 2 as well, just for what it's worth. I have a feeling our top 2 are the same.
yeah. So actually, a lot of similarities to About Face by Colonel Hackworth, which was in my top 10, but didn't make the top 5. But I just thought Once an Eagle was a little better. And Once an Eagle is a novel, but it covers covers a lot of the recent wars. I mean, World War I, World War II, and then in a soldier's life through that. So you see the politics of the army. You see good soldiers, bad soldiers, good leaders, bad leaders. There's just I remember in that podcast episode, it was like a lot of the lessons that we have learned from books of the Books of Titans list were all encapsulated in this one book. And
in
so
narrative
it was
form. Yeah, it's a brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant book.
yeah. So yeah, since it was your number 2, anything else to add to that?
Well, if you want to laugh and cry and maybe cry a little bit more at different points of a book, that's probably your choice. I mean, that's going to get you, that's going to run you through the full gamut of human emotion, and get you to do so in ways that force you to think about what it is to be a leader, what it is to to live ethically, what it is to what war actually is, all sorts of things. It's a tremendous book, and that's why it's number 2 on my list as well. And number 1, I have a feeling, is the same for both of us. So I'm just going to skip to my number 1, which is also, I'm pretty sure, your number 1, and that is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yep.
To me, this is a book that really probably should be assigned reading for every high schooler or college student. I prefer high schooler, just so that everybody can do it, but or adult reading, really. I mean, if not everybody goes to college, and a lot of people in high school would not be quite ready for this. But if actually, even if you're not ready for this is the kind of book that you need to read. It's a staggering book. It's one of the more valuable books I've ever read, not just as a part of this project, but it's one that needs to be on the rotation, on a regular rotation in terms of reading list for me, probably for quite a long time. I'm going to revisit this more than once. I've already found myself at different points in conversation or otherwise just going back to the book to reflect on some of the really important points that he has to make. And it also has a worthwhile, there's some major worthwhile takeaways, not just in terms of thinking about professional life and, what it is to be a leader or anything else, but about the meaning of life and what it is to be a human being and the value of life and all of that is just, it's a tremendous book. It's one of the best books, I think, of the 20th century, certainly one of the best books I've ever read, and one that I can't recommend highly enough.
Yeah, we had a few books on the list where it's either about war or it's about this, where he's a survivor of 5 concentration camps, and there's a learning and there's just an intensity to those books that you don't get in other books. I mean, it might take somebody a lifetime to gather a few of the lessons that he gathered within a few year time span of seeing the extremes of human horrors and human kindness all within the same place. And when a book is written from that vantage point, it's something to pay attention to. And I think that's one thing that made Once an Eagle and About Face also so very powerful, is that they were in that in a war zone, and so it's life and death. It's important decisions. It's decisions that affect a lot of lives, and then just in terms of one thing I would and this can maybe kind of lead into our next section of key takeaways. But one thing that I would, I guess, start to notice in a lot of the books that we read were the counterintuitive things that stuck out. And Man's Search for Meaning was just full of those counterintuitive things, and even established wisdom where Frankel would take on who's the Freud. He would take on Freud and some of the established wisdom of the age, and said, actually, when man is pressed, that's not what he does. And so just a lot of other counterintuitive things, like a lot of times the people that would give their last bit of bread were the ones that ended up surviving. And you would think you would want to hoard everything for yourself in those situations, but there's something about the human spirit that keeps you going if you're caring about others' needs in those situations. So let's take it into that next section of some of the key takeaways or lessons that we saw, not necessarily just in one book, but things and themes that we saw throughout a lot of the books. So
the first back and forth on these. The first one that sticks out to me that came up over and over and over again is the value of time.
Yep.
Is reassessing the way that you live your life and reorganizing the way that you do things so that you can place the maximum value on time. Only focus on money in as much as money can be exchanged for time. Only focus on anything that you do. You have to constantly be looking at, listen, I'm only going to have so many more seconds in my life, so many more minutes, so many more days in my life. Is this what I want to be spending my time on? Is this what I value? Is this the why for which I live? That came up over and over and over again. And by this point, it's come up in our podcast a lot, but that's just the better books in particular, they just keep hammering that point away on what really do you value, and you'd better put your time there, and you'd better guard your time, because the thief of time is going to come in, and you're going to look at your life and, toward the end, or if you get that chance, and you're going to go, man, I wish I hadn't wasted all of that time or all those days on X. And, that's probably the biggest thing that over and over and over again, I can remember coming up across a wide range of books.
Yeah, that was one of the top things I noticed. And the funny thing about that one was it was in such a variety of books. I mean, it was in our second book, Old Man and the Sea. So it was in novels. It was in nonfiction. It was in business books. It was in kind of more the self-help genre. It was in all these different kinds of books. And that same lesson weaved itself through so many of those. One of the other ones I remember talking about a lot, and even in our most recent episodes, was taking first things first. If you take the right things first, if you take the first things first, the other things will often follow. But if you focus on the second things, if you focus on the wrong things, the first things are not going to follow. So just the importance of focus. I think this goes into a lot of what you were talking about with the effective executive, prioritization, and focusing on the right things, doing the first things first. And you would often allude to the C.S. Lewis quote on that. And we had to have talked about that 5 to 10 different episodes.
Yeah,
it came up quite a bit.
Yeah, somewhere 8 or more. And that's a big theme throughout Man's Search for Meaning as well. Mm-hmm. And actually in some ways he actually puts it even more completely than the Lewis quote that I had previously used as often. And I'm going to start using some of the material from Man's Search for Meaning on that as often as not. So yeah, that came up over and over and over again. Yeah. So trying to think of some others that came up repeatedly. I think another is, don't necessarily trust your first, don't trust, think about the way to put this. Don't trust received wisdom of your era. Try to think through the why that gets beyond the assumptions that everybody around you shares. That comes up a lot, that, a lot of times the truth is actually counterintuitive, because the way that things, the assumptions of the time that we live in may be the sorts of things that, a generation from now, people will be saying, wow, I can't believe people used to think that, but we often don't consider those things, and wind up in trouble as a result. So that's another one that, you know, look for the counterintuitive. And actually, if you think about this in terms of business and other things, it's precisely there in the counterintuitive, and specifically the counterintuitive that is super simple and elegant and makes so much sense once you actually think about it, where the real value is. And so that's another thing that came up, I think, repeatedly throughout this, is to always have your eye out for where your own assumptions and the things that you take for granted as a result of just living in the era that you do aren't necessarily right.
Mm-hmm. One thing I saw come up quite a bit is the power of daily habits. I think until last year, and then probably the previous year, where I started seeing this pop up more and more, I would my focus was always on goals. Like, and I would set them at the beginning of the year. Like, here's what I want to accomplish this year, and it was a goal, but it was never. Sometimes I would make it, but there was never really a plan in place. But instead of doing goals, thinking about it in daily habits and like slight changes in a daily habit, if you can make tremendous impacts later in life. So that one was really powerful to me, and I've tried to make that change in my life, and instead of thinking over a goal I want to accomplish, thinking of that goal, but then, okay, what are the small things I can do every day? And not that I'm drastically changing my life here, but what are some very small steps I can take on a daily basis that will put me on that path?
Yeah, that again, that there have been some similar things for me. I think maybe the biggest thing is that I'm at kind of a transition point, an inflection point, having finished my PhD just before we started this project, and being in a position where we just having moved and some other things in terms of my life, supporting my wife as she's in med school, a lot of different things where I'm having to assess exactly how I want to arrange things so that the most valuable stuff is up front moving forward. And there are a number of these books that, as I reflect on them, it's like, okay, I need to make sure that habit is something that I'm going to reinforce. Maybe I need to cut this side gig that I've been doing for a while in order to, focus better on some of these things that I think have more long-term potential or that I value more, et cetera. Maybe in terms of overall career path, maybe this is something closer to what I actually want than this. So it's not been as much in terms of individual specific things, but there's been a lot of reflection on, what are my essentials? What are the practices that I need to put in place in order to accomplish those essentials? And then, in terms of some of the fictional stuff that we read, thinking through those situations and the decisions that those characters or narrative situations were involved in, saying, how are my situations analogous to that, and how can I learn from some of the things that those characters did or didn't do, and what I agree with or disagree with. I think that's another, that's along the same line.
Mm-hmm. I have one other one that I saw recall popping up quite a bit, and that was humor, the importance of humor, especially in survival situations. So we saw this in Man's Search for Meaning. We saw it in the Deep Survival book, and then in other places as well. Just in some of the war books, whether they were fiction or nonfiction, the importance of humor in those situations to get you through. And then, of course, we had the Steve Martin book, stand-up comedy, and just something that kept coming up. And I guess just the idea of not taking things too seriously, no matter how grave they are, and always keeping that sense of humor going, and that being a really important piece of helping you keep moving forward.
Yeah, no doubt. So now for this last part of the show, we do want to talk a little bit about some future podcast plans, how how we're going to proceed with the podcast from here, and lead into some of that. So let's go ahead and go to that. Eric, I think you have the first few thoughts there.
Yeah. So the origin of the project was me reading Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss late 2016 and just seeing all the suggested books and that wanting to read through those and this idea of a quote that Kevin Kelly has, that life is short and there are too many books to read. Someone or something has to choose or whisper in our ear to help us decide. That was my favorite part of Tools of Titans, were those book suggestions. So Tim Ferriss, for every person he had on his podcast, would ask, what's your favorite book and what is your most gifted book? And then he would compile that list. So as I was reading that book, I just put a spreadsheet together, and the final list was over 150 books that were suggested or most gifted by these top performers and influencers. And so of that list, I said, I'm going to do a challenge here and try to read one a week, and I'm going to choose 52 of these. And so the 2017 list was 52 books that were suggested by people in Tools of Titans. We covered a third of the total books. So in 2018, we opened that list up to any book that was ever suggested by guests on the Tim Ferriss Show podcast. So that opened it up to probably 1,500 total books. And so this year, half of my books were one suggested on Ferriss's podcast, and same for Jason. And then the other half were books that I just wanted to read, and likewise same for Jason. So as we move forward, I'm getting more into following things I'm really interested in, kind of continuing on with books that are suggested by people, but not necessarily on the Tim Ferriss Show podcast. And so as I look for my potential list going into 2019, there's only 5 or so books that are actually suggested on the Ferriss podcast. And so we're moving away from that in the sense of everything having to be suggested by a guest on the Tim Ferriss Show podcast,
which we always, I mean, to some degree, we were always planning on doing, because we knew that was that following that particular list was not going to work long term, but it was a good starting point. Yeah,
and so going forward, our list will be taken more from a variety of places instead of just one source, and I'm going to continue sharing how I found out about the book, if it was suggested by somebody, because a lot of the times they are. I have kind of a weird thing. I mean, I take the whole year to think through what I want to read the next year, and I put a lot of stock into if I see a book in a lot of places, or I see it suggested by a variety of people. So I really think through that list a lot. And so in terms of the reading list, it's going to evolve a little bit. And for the podcast, we are going to look to shorten the episodes. That's the main critique that we've gotten for the podcast. And so what we're looking at doing is keeping it more in the 30 to 45 minute range going forward, and focusing on a few things. So starting the episode with a brief overview of the book, and then covering the one thing that stuck out to us. And so sometimes both Jason and I will have read the same book, so we'll both share those things. And then other times it'll take an interview format where I'll interview Jason on a book that he's read, so he'll cover the overview of the book and then go into the one thing that really stuck out to him. And the reason for the one thing is I think that helps us remember the book, remember the main lesson, and then it helps you as the listener to have one key takeaway from the book. But
and not every episode will necessarily narrow it to one thing, because some books won't be amenable to that. But we're going to basically reformat the episodes a bit in terms of how we are approaching it in order to make sure that we don't go quite as long as we'd like. I mean, I think our target zone, just thinking about this from our own listening habits and all of that, would probably be best in the 30 to 45 minute range, rather than going quite as long as we have on some of these. So we'll try to hit that, and some books will warrant a longer treatment, but for the most part, we're going to try to hit a little bit shorter zone.
Yeah, and if you've made it this far, as we release this episode, I'm also going to release a survey, and so that'll be in the show notes. I'll have that on our Twitter and Instagram feeds. I'd love for you to take the survey, and give us your thoughts on the podcast, and so yeah, there'll be some questions in there and some opportunities for you to share some of your thoughts. We'd really appreciate if you take the time to do that.
Anything that, you really want to keep in terms of, what you've found most valuable about the episodes. And also, any formatting suggestions or things that you think would help shorten, but basically make the episodes more useful. We're open to lots of suggestions there. We want this to be a useful evergreen podcast for those who listen afterward, or who can listen for years to come. So we're hoping to be able to get that done and work from there. So I think that basically wraps it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Let's wrap.
Let's go ahead and wrap it. So as always, if you have been enjoying this podcast, please subscribe on via Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We're available just about anywhere. And also rate and review us. 5-star rating and reviewing helps us get exposed to more people and brings in a wider audience, which encourages us to continue the project and also brings other benefits as well. So we really appreciate that for those of you who've done it. And then, Eric, you also have some stuff to say about the Patreon thingy that we've set up.
Yeah, we have a Patreon page. We have decided not to advertise in the traditional sense. We may advertise some of our own products going forward, or services, or books, but we don't want to inundate you with ads that you hear on every other podcast. So we're on the value for value model. If you get value out of this podcast, we'd love for you to return the favor, return the value that you're getting in through our Patreon page. So it's linked from our website. We have it in all the show notes, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. So that'll close us out for today. We'll be back next week with a new book, book 53, and we look forward to covering that one. We have some really good ones coming up, ones that where one of us has read it, and then also a few where we both read the book. So looking forward to that. Thanks for listening. Jason, you got your traditional closeout.
Yep. Keep reading, keep listening, and keep improving.
Keep it real.
We should have done our least favorites too. It's I definitely have some I really didn't like.
Yeah, I can easily pull those up.
I know. One thing that surprised me is that I expected you to have, Vagabonding in your top 5 and definitely Blood Meridian. I knew that. I figured that one would be in your top 10 at least. But
well, I ended up making it through 51 books last year in 2017. And if I look at my list, I ranked them. Number 51, which means the one I despised the most, was Blood Meridian. Number 50 is Vagabonding. Yep. So you nailed those.
Yeah, I figured those would be right at the top of the list there, but I guess you didn't like them as much. Anyhow,
any that stick out to you?
Oh, I detested Blood Meridian. I thought it was. I did not think it was all that good. Let's see. Wasn't a fan of Blood Meridian. I didn't get anything out of Stone Soup, although, obviously it's short and it's a picture book for kids and kids tend to like it. I just didn't really, as we talked about, we didn't really get a whole lot out of that.
Yeah, that was
Um,
one of my top five least favorite.
yeah,
Although my daughter's been reading it in my office the last few mornings.
well, there you go. Hopefully she's getting more out of it than we did. Um, and, I found certain things in vagabonding helpful, but my thought was if you're gonna read vagabonding, you're better off just reading Walden.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a few that weren't super great, but
I had Buck Up, Suck Up,
oh yeah,
and Foul Up,
that would probably be my third least favorite.
and then Born Standing Up. And what's funny is I enjoyed Born Standing Up, but the the books were so good overall that ended up being the fifth least liked book of
Yeah.
mine.
See, that's the thing is like once I get past Stone Soup, I really don't have a whole lot that we've reviewed that I didn't like, or at least didn't find something of value on. I mean, I had issues with Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World in terms of the history quality, but that's another thing.
Hmm.
Again, it has to do with as we talked about in the episode, all sorts of stuff, but it's still a worthwhile book in lots of respects. So yeah, I just say I disliked Blood Meridian, wasn't a big fan of Stone Soup, and Buck Up, Suck Up, Foul Up was those are I'd say Blood Meridian, Buck Up, Suck Up, Foul Up. Those are my two least favorite, and then I didn't get anything out of Stone Soup. So other than that, I thought it was pretty good year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Well, we should have put that in. I made this.